They don't give you much time for a transition here, but I'm going to have to transition in my mind from Central Europe, Poland, the war with the axis of tyranny, to Tibet, which is a very, very special subject for Forum 2000. I don't know if it's fully appreciated, but His Holiness the Dalai Lama was here for the first conference in 1997. He participated in 4 conferences after that and in 2 other Forum 2000 events. He was the first visitor to the Czech Republic when Václav Havel was elected president. He was the first person Havel invited. And near Havel's death, 1 week before he died in December of 2011, he was the last visitor who spent time with Havel. And they had a very, very special relationship. And after Havel passed away, we had a memorial service for him in Washington. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote a beautiful, beautiful statement in which he talked about the importance of Forum 2000. But he also said that I seem to have been his last foreign visitor, and I cannot help from thinking that from a spiritual point of view, can we please quiet it down in the corner there? Please, and leave the room if you want to talk. His Holiness said at the memorial service, he said, I cannot help but think that from a spiritual point of view, there was a strong connection between us. So it's a very special occasion to have my dear friend, Penpa Tsering, Sikyong, Penpa, that's what I was told I should call you. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
And I want to begin with a question about what's going on today in Tibet. I mean, you know, the Genocide Convention never accepted the idea of cultural genocide. His Holiness said that China was committing cultural genocide against Tibet. He said that 15 years ago, and since then it's only gotten worse. And almost 1 million Tibetan children, most of the children of Tibet, are being sent to state-run boarding schools, separated from their families, stripped of their language and traditions, and they're really trying to destroy the culture by taking the kids away from their family. And under the Genocide Convention, there are clauses in the Genocide Convention, even though it doesn't recognize cultural genocide, but they talk about deliberately, and this is from the convention, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction. And that also considered a genocidal act is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In other words, taking them out of their culture and trying to destroy them. And if you would just reflect on that, about what China is doing, and is it cultural genocide, and how do you respond to that?
It's definitely a cultural genocide that's going on inside Tibet. The Chinese government likes to call Tibet a socialist paradise. And I don't know of any paradise where people self-immolate themselves. In the last, from 2009 till about 3 years ago, 157 Tibetans have self-immolated, burned themselves to death. In Czech Republic, you had 1 incident in 1968. And in Vietnam, you had 1 incident in 1963. In Tibet, 157 Tibetans, mostly young Tibetans who are between the age of 17 to 35, who have never witnessed independent Tibet, who have never witnessed cultural revolution, those 10 years of destruction where they destroyed more than 6,000 Tibetan monasteries, and 1.2 million Tibetans died as a direct or indirect result of China's occupation of Tibet. That speaks for itself. These younger generations see what Chinese government is doing to Tibet and the Tibetan people today. And that is what drives them to this desperate act. So when we talk about these desperate acts, then we are talking about all the ills that we are facing. In terms of political space, there is none whatsoever. It's more like George Orwell's 1984 coming into reality, where the state surveils everything and controls everything. So we talk about there being no political space whatsoever. Today, if I think about self-immolating myself, then I have to think about all my family members. I cannot think only about myself. It's not like Tibetans cannot kill Chinese. They can, but they don't do it because His Holiness always said that if you take up violence, I will no more be responsible for the cost. So Tibetans also restrain themselves from taking up violence. You talked about the colonial-style boarding schools. That's aimed at eradicating, changing one generation of Tibetan into completely Chinese. So you have to learn Communist Party thought, you have to learn Xi Jinping thought, you have to practice loyalty to the party, and all these things are happening in Tibet. And in addition to what was reported by the UN Special Rapporteurs on the colonial-style boarding schools, now they have, since 2018, they started closing all the schools, private schools, not just in Tibet, but also in southern Mongolia, in Uyghur, and in Tibet. Lately, in the last 6 months, we have been witnessing more cases of Chinese government closing down monastic schools. And that is where they learn Tibetan and Tibetan Buddhism.
And the purpose is to destroy minority cultures. Is it to destroy a people?
Unfortunately, China is China is the only country that is moving towards uniculturalism, whereas the whole world is moving towards multiculturalism at the expense of all other nationalities, whether it be Tibetans or Uyghurs or Mongols.
Well, you know, the United States has recognized what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs formally as genocide because of forced sterilization. They're trying to destroy the people in that way. Raphael Lemkin, who was the author of the Genocide Convention, wanted cultural genocide to be included in the convention, but he didn't have a consensus. But there are clauses, as I said before, that could be interpreted. And should there be a campaign now to expose what China is doing and to try to get countries like the United States to say that China is committing genocide against the people of Tibet?
We are, as the elected political leader, I travel around the world. I've traveled to more than 35 different countries speaking about these things. So we are continuing to advocate for the Tibetan suffering inside Tibet. And I don't know whether the public here knows about the middle way policy that His Holiness has.
I want to get to that.
Yeah. His Holiness has adopted since 1973. When I say 1973, you should also know what was happening inside Tibet. From 66 to 76, there was this 10 years of cultural revolution where they were destroying everything old. And the real threat was the existential threat to the Tibetans, whether Tibetans would remain Tibetans or would there be Tibetanness in Tibet. So since that time, His Holiness always appreciates the concept of European Union. If it is not for the concept of European Union, Europeans would still be fighting with each other. So if that can be applied to Europe, then why not Tibet with China? Whether we like it or not, we cannot lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere in the Pacific or Atlantic. So we lived as neighbors for centuries, and we lived in peace with China. We have not done nothing wrong to the Chinese people. When the Mongols invaded China, Mongols were killing Chinese people, and our lamas stopped Mongolians from killing Chinese people. We have done nothing wrong against the Chinese, but we are suffering this fate under Communist China.
As Sikyong, you have pressed for the resumption of a dialogue between China and Tibet. The dialogue, the negotiations that our mutual friend Lodi Gary conducted for so many, I think there were 9 or 10 rounds of negotiations. The Chinese cut it off, I think it was in 2010. You have continued to try for, even while China is committing cultural genocide against the people of Tibet, you have pressed for a continuation of the dialogue. Are you still doing that, and what progress has there been?
We are committed to finding a nonviolent, mutually beneficial, negotiated solution that would be lasting. If you look at the conflicts around in this world, you look at Israel, Gaza, or Ukraine, Russia, or some other 55 conflicts that is going on around the world as we speak, the message of nonviolence is very, very important, that His Holiness has been advocating for so many decades. So we in future also, as I mentioned, we cannot lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere else. So we have to live as neighbors. Whenever we get to go back, we have to live as neighbors with China, with India, with Nepal, with Bhutan, all those countries that has border with Tibet. And some people don't know that Tibet is huge. Tibet is 25% of China's landmass. It's about 2.37, some say 2.5 million square kilometers out of 9.7 million square kilometers. That is the total size of China. So Tibet is huge. And we are committed to finding a nonviolent solution. And I did commit to having back channels, but it's not worth speaking about. It's just more to send messages to each other. Several months ago, I had the opportunity to meet with President Macron for a short while, and the next day I received message from Beijing saying, what is your motivation to meet with President Macron now? Just 6 days before President Xi Jinping was coming to France and Serbia and Hungary. So this is the kind of back channels we have, but it's not worth mentioning. Even if we do manage to build some more contact with the Chinese, if you look at what Xi Jinping is doing to the Tibetans, to the Uyghurs, to the Mongols, to Hong Kongers, and to Chinese pro-democracy.
But has there been any progress whatsoever?
No.
But you're going to continue.
I have no expectation.
Is there any alternative to trying to reopen the dialogue with China? Is there any alternative?
But right now, if you look at what Xi Jinping is doing, not only to Tibetans, but Chinese people also, it looks very unlikely that there could be any outcome. That's why I keep saying, if you have good hospitals in your country, we bring Chinese leaders one by one, do brain surgery and put common sense and send them back. That's all they need to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict.
You know, one of the things that worries many people the most is the succession process. I think on July 6th, if I'm not mistaken, His Holiness is going to turn 90 years old.
Yes.
And China is threatening to take over the succession process. His Holiness and the Tibetan government in exile, which you lead, have not announced any roadmap for the succession process. It was said that perhaps when His Holiness turns 90, he will announce a roadmap for succession to keep the succession process out of the control of the Chinese regime. Can you tell us anything about that, about where things stand in the succession process? I mean, I hope His Holiness is going to live forever, certainly for 120 years. I think that would be a wonderful thing. They used to live that long in biblical times. Maybe he could do it. But if it happens, what's the process?
Even at the age of 90, His Holiness points at his teeth and says, I have not lost one tooth. And I'll live for another 2 decades or more. And there are propitious pre-signs that this Dalai Lama will live very long, up to 113 years of age. So I keep telling the Chinese, this message is for you, that this Dalai Lama will live very long. So let's see whether communism outlives the Dalai Lama or the Dalai Lama outlives communism.
Well, I have no doubt that spiritually he will outlive communism, but we'll see what happens. But look, 90 years is 90 years.
Yes.
Are you going to be coming forward, announcing some kind of a roadmap for the succession process?
This is a purely religious activity when you look for reincarnation. And His Holiness also says that if Chinese government is really serious about reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first. Because this is very unique to Tibetan Buddhism, where you have reincarnated what China calls as living Buddhas. And they've been preparing the death of this Dalai Lama for the last 20 years or more. And they are still very active. Any visitor that comes to Tibet, they always talk about His Holiness reincarnation. So they are not bothered about the living 14th, but they are more bothered about the yet-to-come 15th. And even at 90, if His Holiness feels good, then he might even say that it's too early. Who knows? That's some 9 months down the line. And there's only one document regarding His Holiness reincarnation. That is September 2011 document, which you mentioned, where His Holiness might take certain decisions when he reaches the age of 90, which is 6th of July, 2025. And from the media, from the politicians, I keep getting this question as to how this will move on. So from our side, from the Tibetan side, I keep telling the Chinese, have you not learned enough lesson from the Panchen Lama saga? For those who don't know about Panchen Lama, is regarded as the second highest Lama in the Gelug hierarchy, and at the age of 6, the Panchen Lama chosen by His Holiness has been abducted by the Chinese government, and we still don't know whether he's alive or not. Whether if he's alive, whether he has been given the education to carry forward his responsibilities when the time comes. So some tell me that you don't seem to have a process in place. So I said, that's your perspective. But the decision that His Holiness has taken so far is very wise in the sense that Chinese government cannot handle unpredictability. That is why they could never handle Trump. When I was traveling somewhere in Thailand, I read a newspaper saying the Chinese business people are going to oracles to find out what Trump is going to decide next. So maybe next year His Holiness will say something about his succession plans or reincarnation plans. But from the Tibetan, the exiled government, what we are trying to do is the first community that's going to be impacted by His Holiness reincarnation is the Tibetan Buddhist communities. So we are collecting statements, resolutions from all these communities as evidence of what Tibetan people want or the Buddhist world want. So when I mentioned Panchen Lama, the same Panchen Lama, there were now 2 Panchen Lamas, one abducted by the Chinese government, we don't know whether he's alive or not, one appointed by the Chinese, selected by the Chinese government, and they try to send him to Tibet from time to time to show the world that Tibetans inside Tibet have faith or respect to the Chinese Panchen Lama. Now the news that I get to hear from inside Tibet is traditionally when you go to a Lama to seek blessings or teachings, you make offerings to the Lama. These days, the Chinese government pay money to the public to go and receive Chinese Panchen Lama. So Tibetans inside Tibet just call him, he's another leader. So to show their displeasure, they don't sell pictures of the Chinese Panchen Lama. They can't sell pictures of His Holiness Dalai Lama's Panchen Lama. So they sell pictures of the last Panchen Lama, the 10th Panchen Lama, so to show their displeasure. And yes, His Holiness will definitely come out with statements or ideas about how the process will take place. But whether it's going to be next year or a few years after that, it's up to His Holiness to decide.
Right. Well, you know, there's a Yiddish word called chutzpah for an atheistic government taking over a religious process. Which is what they're trying to do to the Tibetan people.
That's why His Holiness says that if Chinese government is really serious about reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first.
Right, right.
Believe in the concept of life after death. And then maybe look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first. Deng Xiaoping's reincarnation second. Now Jiang Zemin is also not with us. Maybe they should look for Jiang Zemin's reincarnation also. Then maybe the Dalai Lamas.
Well, you know, when they broke off negotiations with Tibet back, you know, a little over 10 years ago, they said that they will not resume negotiations and talking to Tibet until Tibet recognizes that it has been part of China forever, which is not true. It's a lie. Could you address this issue of the historical question? Was there ever any point historically when Tibet was a part of China?
No, that is why we have been working with the U.S. Congress for over the last 2 years to get this Resolve Tibet Act, because U.S. is the only government that has a law on Tibet, the 2002 Tibet Policy Act that has been amended to 2000 Tibet Support and Policy Act of 2020, which added the element of reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And over the last 2 years, we have been working with the Congress to get this Resolve Tibet Act passed, which was signed by President Joe Biden into a law this July, on 12th of July this year. And this law talks about 4 main issues. Because the Chinese government says that there's no Tibet problem, that Tibet is a socialist paradise. Then I say, if Tibet is a socialist paradise, then why don't you allow other people to see the paradise for themselves, whether it's a paradise or a hell? So the law says that Tibet is yet an unresolved conflict, and it should be resolved under international law. The second element of the law says that Tibetan people have the right to self-determination, which is following up on the 1961 General Assembly resolution of the United Nations. And the third element of that law is to negate or not accept China's narrative that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. So that is why I keep carrying two books with me, one by Michael Van Walt, one Prague, Tibet Brief 2020, and there's also a Chinese professor, because they both looked at Tibetan history from two different perspectives. Michael Van Walt looked at Tibet history from a international legal perspective, and he proves that whether it was Tibet-Yuan relation, Yuan is that period when Mongols ruled China from 1271 to 1368. And then the Mongols were overthrown by the Mings, who are real Han Chinese, and they ruled China from 1368 to 1644. And then the Mings were overthrown by the Qings, who are Manchus. The societal perspective of Chinese people is that Manchus are not Chinese. And we have our parallel history, where when the Mongols ruled China, we had a Sakyapa dynasty. When Mings were ruling, we had three dynasties, the Pamadrupa dynasty, Rinpoche dynasty, and Tepasangpa dynasty, till 1642. And the fifth Dalai Lama took over the spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet in 1642, 2 years before the Qings overthrew the Mings in China. So you have this Michael's book, and then there is one Professor Lau, who was a Chinese. When he was in his university days, he used to be intrigued by this question as to why Chinese government is asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC. Because Chinese government has been saying Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. If it has been part of China since ancient times, then why is Chinese government asking governments to say Tibet is part of PRC now? So that is why after his retirement, he took out all the imperial historical documents from the Communist Party website, and now he has come out with a book arguing as to how imperial China, if you can consider the Mongols and Manchus also as Chinese dynasties, then how imperial China has not considered Tibet as part of China. So this was a shift in our strategy, because we still are very committed to middle way, finding a negotiated nonviolent solution. But at the same time, if there are no recognition for the polarities, when we say middle way, there has to be polarities. So one polarity is the present situation of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government, and the other polarity is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. So if there is no recognition for this, then there is no value for middle way. There is no leverage for middle way. That is why when I travel around in these days, I tell governments that if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC, then you are going against international law, because we were forcefully invaded by China in 1951 and 50, and then we were forced to sign this 17-point agreement. That is the only one agreement we have with Communist China on the threat of war. So whether it's happening to Ukraine today or it happened to Tibet 74 years ago, it was the same international law. It is the same international law. And the second thing we tell the international community is that if you keep saying Tibet is part of PRC, and then on the other hand, you keep saying we support negotiations between representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. So you're contradicting yourself. You are removing the very ground for negotiation. When every country in this world keeps repeating this statement that Tibet is part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come talk to us? Then the third thing we tell them is, why is Chinese government asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC? Why not Mongolia? Why not Uyghurs? Why not Manchuria? Why only Tibet? Because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy of their rule in Tibet, right, and they are trying to seek that legitimacy from the international community.
And I think it should be noted that, in the State Department reports, it used to say Tibet is part of China. It doesn't say that anymore. The U.S. has changed and has removed that language. And I would hope that we would. Are you trying to get other governments to remove that kind of language and to not say that Tibet is part of China?
We're waiting for the U.S. election to get over, and then see how we can work with the Congress and the State Department to work with other like-minded countries to take similar positions, so that China will be forced to come and talk to us.
I mean, we gave His Holiness the Democracy Service Medal in 2010. You received it last year. It was a glorious occasion. And I just think it should be said, and maybe you could say a brief word about that because our time is up. But if you could just sort of say a brief word about His Holiness's commitment to democracy. I mean, it's an actually deep commitment. And Penpa, the Sikyong, the head of the government in exile, that government in exile was set up by His Holiness. He wanted to see this happen because he wanted to begin to introduce democracy into the Tibetan system, into the Tibetan culture. And maybe you could just say a word about his commitment to democracy.
His Holiness had been to, when he was 19, 20 years old, he had been to China, met with Mao, Zhou Enlai, and all leaders of those times, and he saw how China functioned. Even though everything looked very orderly, people didn't have the freedom to speak. And then 56, 57, His Holiness was in India, and his just nascent democracy in India, it was very chaotic in the parliament, but everybody had the freedom to speak. So when he came into exile in 1959, not even 1 year after coming into exile, under very difficult circumstances, resettling Tibetans, 85,000 Tibetan refugees into India and Nepal and Bhutan, he adopted democracy, and he is a true democrat, and he is a visionary leader. So 5 years down the line, now I'm a very ordinary person. So I can be in this position because of His Holiness' vision. So His Holiness was preparing us. He knows that he won't live forever. So if it takes very long for the Tibetan struggle, if we need to continue that struggle for long, then we should be able to take up our responsibilities. And today, we are in a position, after 65 years, that we have democracy in exile. We have our parliament, we have our Supreme Justice Commission, we have our cabinet with 7 departments, we have our election commission, our public service commission, Auditor General's office, and we conduct election in one day all over the world in more than 30 different countries. And that is how we get elected into the Sikyong's position, or the political leader, or the parliament with 45 members, and one of our parliamentarians is also here. So we are the only exiled government with a fully functional democratic polity. And that is because of His Holiness' vision.
It's an extraordinary accomplishment. I can remember, by the way, when I started at NED and I was beginning to introduce some requests for proposals for Tibet. And one of the board members said, you know, Tibet is a theocracy. It's not a democracy. But His Holiness didn't accept that idea.
He had been devolving as people progress, because when we talk about democracy in other countries, it's always you have to fight for democracy with bloodshed and, you know, all that. But His Holiness has been empowering us all the time as he sees that we are getting prepared more and more. Every 10 years, he has been, you know, devolving his powers. And 2011, he said, I'm going to devolve all my political and administrative responsibilities, now which is in the hand of the democratic elected leadership.
You know, His Holiness is truly one of the great figures in the world today, and we shouldn't take that for granted. And I just want to note that in the letter, which I'm going to give to Forum 2000, that his message when we had the memorial service of Václav Havel, he said, I have assured Forum 2000 that I shall be very happy to do whatever I can to contribute to its work and to keep alive the spirit of freedom that Václav Havel made such efforts to promote. And I think that's so important. And I hope that you will convey to His Holiness the love and respect of the Forum 2000 conference, because we do love and respect him. Thank you very much.
Maybe I want to add with one last thing. At this conference also, I see a lot of contradictions, a lot of paradoxes. So I think one of the topics for the next conference should be democracies empowering authoritarianism. I believe, as a Tibetan who followed nonviolence as a means of resolving conflicts, if you have to bring China on their knees, give them less business, or at least have balanced trade. Because of all the foreign exchange reserve they have, they splurge it on Belt and Road Initiative, creating more dead economies around the world, splurge it on space technology, on military. Because of economy, they have all this political power and military power. So our friends in Europe tell me the dragon is biting at us. Then I told them, dragon at one time was very weak. Who fed the dragon to become so strong to be able to bite it? It's United States, Europe, Japan,
And there's
Taiwan,
nobody who opposed that more than Václav Havel.
Yes, so if you want to bring China on its knees, then economy is the linchpin.
Yeah. I've received katas from Tibetan friends forever, but I'm told by my Tibetan friends that it would not be inappropriate if I gave one to you. So I want to conclude by putting this around your neck.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Doc.